hitting me. Stop hitting me. These are the words that Adriana Testa cried out as the defendant hit her over the head with a hammer. Her cries were for help, but our cries today are for justice. When I'm finished speaking with you, the judge will instruct you on the law, and she will ask you to return a verdict of guilty or not guilty. We, the state, are asking you to find the defendant guilty of first-degree assault and criminal domestic violence. And in doing so, we have to prove each of these crimes to you beyond a reasonable doubt. We had to prove to you assault in the first degree. And in order to do that, we had to prove to you that the defendant intended to cause Ms. Testa serious bodily injury and that he followed through with those intentions by means of a deadly weapon. We are also charging the defendant with criminal domestic violence. Someone is guilty of criminal domestic violence when they are in a close and intimate relationship with their victim. No one disputed here in court today that the defendant and Ms. Testa were in an intimate relationship. So therefore, if you find him guilty of assault in the first degree, he is also guilty of criminal domestic violence. Today's case surrounds the events of June 14, 2014. On that day, Peter Seeger, the defendant, got his most prized possession out of storage to hang in his living room. Now, he tried to hang that painting, and he asked Ms. Testa to help him. And when she did so, she just slightly dropped it. And that's what caused the defendant to snap. Enraged at the sight of his beloved painting crashing to the ground, he picked up the nearest weapon he had, the hammer he was using to hang the painting. And he hit Ms. Testa not once, but twice with that hammer. Ms. Testa ran out the front door. She was scared for her life, and she ran down the street. But what he did to her in that trailer wasn't good enough, because the defendant ran after her in the street, hammer in hand. The entire time she ran, Ms. Testa screamed, "Stop hitting me." Now, the defendant thought he was off the hook. He thought that there were no eyewitnesses to the atrocity he had just committed. But luckily, Jordan Kravitz did see the incident. And he called the police because he saw Ms. Testa running down the street covered in blood. He saw the defendant chasing after her with a hammer. As the defendant said himself, even though the supposed love of his life was hiding, covered in blood in a boat, he went back to the trailer to hide. Members of the jury, the defense tried to bring into question Ms. Testa's credibility to you today. They tried to bring into question her drinking habits and bring up reasons why you shouldn't believe her. But ask yourselves, why should you believe her? Ms. Testa has nothing to lose by testifying here today. She is young, she is scared, and she is pregnant with the child of the man who beats her. But she got up on that stand today in front of a courtroom of strangers and had to recount the most brutal and terrifying night of her life. She has nothing to gain, but everything to lose, because by testifying against the defendant, she could lose her job, she could lose her home, she could lose her financial support, and she loses the father of her child. Yes, Ms. Testa changed her story, but remember why she did so. To protect her unborn child. She may have had a change of story, but she never had a change of heart. You heard from Dr. Shepard today, the doctor who treated Ms. Testa that night in the emergency room. Dr. Shepard, in his 20 years of experience, told you that Ms. Testa was suffering from 2 simple depressed skull fractures. Now, those simple depressed skull fractures don't bleed, so that explains why Ms. Testa didn't have any blood coming from her head, and that explains why there is no blood coming from that hammer. It wasn't because her injuries weren't serious. It was because her injuries were so serious that it cracked her skull without breaking her skin. Dr. Shepard also told you why she was sent home with concussion papers that night. Because when you have a simple depressed skull fracture, you most likely have a concussion too. he explained to you why she went home that night. It wasn't because her injuries weren't serious, but it was because after everything she had been through, she just wanted to go home. Members of the jury, remember what we had to prove to you today. We had to prove to you that Miss Testa was suffering serious bodily injury. So whether or not she was actually suffering from a fracture or a concussion doesn't matter. Because if the defendant took that hammer and hit Miss Testa in the head with it, then that alone is enough to prove intent to cause serious bodily injury. So the defense's entrance of the CT scan and making Dr. Shepard seem less credible doesn't even matter. You also heard from Mr. Kravitz today. And Mr. Kravitz was the defendant's next-door neighbor and very good friend. But despite that, Mr. Kravitz still called 911 because what he witnessed in that exact moment caused him to fear for Miss Testa's life enough to call 911. One moment, please. Members of the jury, we proved each of our elements to you beyond a reasonable doubt. And again, those elements are intent to cause serious bodily injury by means of a deadly weapon. We proved intent to cause bodily injury today when we proved that Miss Testa was hit in the head with a hammer. Now remember that intent can be formed in the split second before the action takes place. So if 1 second before he brought that hammer down, not once, but twice, the defendant intended to cause Miss Testa serious bodily injury, then we proved our first element. We proved our second element today as well. Intent to cause serious bodily injury by means of a deadly weapon. Now, Dr. Shepard told you that Miss Testa's injuries were consistent in size and shape to a hammer. This was corroborated by Mr. Kravitz, the only eyewitness to the events we are here for today. And he told you that he saw the defendant with a hammer in his hand, chasing Miss Testa. Now, in charging the defendant, we have to prove to you that he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean beyond all doubt. It doesn't mean beyond every doubt, because everything in life is subject to some doubt. It's not beyond an imaginary doubt or a shadow of doubt or a fanciful doubt, but it is a doubt that comes out of the evidence and the reasoning that you see in a case. Members of the jury, we proved that the defendant is guilty here today because we proved our elements. Members of the jury, the defense will come before you after I'm finished speaking with you, and keep in mind, the defense has no burden in today's case. They don't have to explain, they don't have to prove anything to you, but when they do choose to present evidence and choose to present testimony, then you have to hold them accountable for it. So members of the jury, keep in mind when the defense gives their closing arguments, why did the defendant have that hammer in his hand when he chased Miss Testa? Why did the defendant leave his bloody girlfriend, who he supposedly loved so much, in the street when he went back to hide? And how does the defense's theory of Miss Testa falling in the street possibly leave her with 2 hammer-sized head wounds to her head? It doesn't add up. Members of the jury, Miss Testa's cries were for help, and our cries were for justice. Don't let her cries be in vain. And that is why we are asking you to find Peter Seeger guilty of first-degree assault and criminal domestic violence. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to set up the courtroom for a demonstrative. May it please the court. of the jury, instability and intoxication lead to inconsistencies. At the beginning of today's trial, my co-counsel stood before you and asked you to keep two questions in mind. What happens when you mix instability with intoxication? And what inconsistencies did you see in Ms. Testa's story and the prosecution's theory of what happened on June 14th, 2014? Well, members of the jury, today you learned that when Ms. Testa's instability mixed with her intoxication, it led to an inconsistent story of what happened that night. Now today you heard a lot about Mr. Peter Paul Seeger. He's known to his friends and his family as Pete. He's a hard-working handyman who was born and raised right here in Lone Star County. And it's in Lone Star that he met the love of his life, Adriana Testa. Everything was going great. He took her in, gave her a place to live. But it changed on June 14th, 2014. You see, because that day, Adriana was sitting at the home, drinking vodka alone. And that's when Pete wanted to fix the house up a bit. He wanted to hang his favorite painting, the Velvet Elvis, on the wall. He went down to the storage shed, brought it into the trailer, laid out all of his tools, and got ready to hang it. But that's when Adriana Testa allowed her instability to show. She started screaming at him, spitting on it, trying to take the painting away. Now, he just thought she was intoxicated and tried to continue to mark the wall to hang up this painting. But that's when she snapped. Miss Testa ran out of the apartment, screaming, yelling, saying that Pete was hitting her. Now, Pete didn't know what to do. He ran after her, trying to help her, trying to stop her. He didn't even have a chance to put his tools away. But as he was running down the street, trying to catch up with her, he realized he was just making matters worse. So he went back inside, hoping that Adriana would cool down. But it was outside that she was stumbling and falling and causing multiple injuries to herself. Now, a neighbor called the police, and luckily, Adriana Testa was able to get the help she needed after falling, hitting her head, hitting her hands, hitting her knees, and scraping her feet. Now, it's that same neighbor who testified today and told you that although he saw what was going on, he never once saw Pete Seeger hit Adriana Testa. Today you learned how Ms. Testa's instability and intoxication led to an inconsistent story. But despite this, Pete Seeger sits on trial today for first-degree assault and criminal domestic violence. And today it is the state and the state alone who holds the burden of proof. That means proving to you beyond any reasonable doubt each and every element of their claim today. That means proving intent to cause serious bodily injury. That means proving that Pete actually caused serious bodily injury to Adriana Testa, and that he did so through use of a deadly weapon. Now, the state must also prove to you that Adriana Testa and Pete Seeger were in an intimate relationship when he committed first-degree assault. Keep in mind, it's each and every one of those elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, this is the highest burden in our entire judicial system. That means that they must prove to you that there is no other reasonable explanation for what happened on June 14, 2014. But today, you learned that there are many inconsistencies in this theory. And when you add all of those inconsistencies together, that is reasonable doubt. Now, the state attempted to prove their case through two witnesses. First, they called Adriana Testa to the stand. Now, during her testimony, we asked you to keep in mind, what signs of instability did you see? And what happened when that mixed with intoxication? Members of the jury, today you learned how she allowed her instability to show. When she snapped, when Pete just wanted to hang a painting on the wall, when she ran down the street and tried to convince people that Pete was hitting her. That instability mixed with intoxication, when she chose to take Xanax that day while she was drinking vodka. Ultimately, It was this intoxication mixed with her instability that led to inconsistencies. These same inconsistencies were seen in the prosecution's next witness. Dr. Derek Shepard took the stand, and during his testimony, we asked you one question. What was inconsistent about his findings of Miss Testa's injuries? Well, there was only one test that was ran on the head wounds that Adriana Testa suffered that night. And that same test that was ran that same day showed normal results. Absolutely no evidence of a fracture, despite his testimony today that she was suffering from a fracture to the skull. Now, how did their doctor deal with this? Well, he didn't order a new test. He didn't go pull the results. He didn't speak to the person who found those results. Instead, he just wrote nonsense across the page. You see, today you learned that he ignored the tests that were ran, and he allowed tests to go unfinished. It's these types of findings that are inconsistent, and it's because of this that the prosecution failed to meet their burden today. Now, after the prosecution called their witnesses, we, the defense, had the opportunity to call our own. Now, keep in mind that we don't have a burden today. We don't have to prove to you exactly what happened. That is because there is a presumption of innocence. There is a presumption of Pete Seeger's innocence. But today we did call two witnesses. We called Pete Seeger to the stand and eyewitness Jordan Kravitz. And when both of them took the stand today, you saw how it was Miss Testa's instability and intoxication that led to these inconsistencies. Now, the state wants you to think that Mr. Kravitz and his eyewitness account is not trustworthy because he's good friends with Pete Seeger. But today he took the stand, he said right here, and he told you why he is in court, to tell you the truth about what happened that night. And the truth is that there are many inconsistencies in the prosecution's theory. The first inconsistency is seen in this hammer. Now, they allege that this is the weapon that was used against Adriana Testa. Today, you heard from Pete Seeger, you heard that the EMT and the eyewitness Jordan Kravitz all saw blood running down Adriana Testa's back, running from the wounds to her head. Yet when you look at this hammer, you see absolutely no blood. That is an inconsistency. This painting. Now, this is the painting of the Velvet Elvis that they claim Adriana Testa dropped. Again, there's no blood on this painting. But there's also not a single scrape, scratch, dent, any damage, despite their claim that she dropped this painting. That is an inconsistency. Now, there's also the CT scan that was ran at the hospital that day. And as we mentioned, this is the only piece of evidence that we have about Adriana Testa's injuries, because there are absolutely no photographs. This shows normal results. No evidence of a fracture was present. That is an inconsistency. And we also have an eyewitness account from Jordan Kravitz. He came before you today and mapped out exactly what he saw. And he told you in this entire area, he never once saw Pete Seeger hit Adriana Testa. And perhaps the biggest inconsistency of them all was that Adriana Testa went to Jordan Kravitz and told him that she made this entire thing up, that she lied to the police, that she actually received her injuries from falling drunk on Canyon Bayou. Members of the jury, when you add that inconsistency with all of these inconsistencies, this is reasonable doubt. Now, the prosecution wants you to think that this case is about a cry for help. And Adriana Testa's instability and intoxication that night, making up that story, that was a cry for help. But the help that she needs is not convicting an innocent man. Today we are crying for justice. So I ask you to focus on all of these inconsistencies, because you'll see that inconsistencies lead to injustice. Find Mr. Peter Paul Seeger not guilty on both charges. Thank you.
Rebuttal? Members of the jury, when I came before you a few minutes ago, I asked you 3 questions, and the defense had an opportunity to clarify those questions in their closing argument, but they didn't. They didn't explain to you why the defendant still had that hammer in his hand as he ran down the street. They didn't explain to you why he left his bleeding girlfriend in the street and then ran back to hide from the police. And they didn't explain to you how in the world 2 hammer-sized head wounds to your head can be caused by their theory of falling in the street. The defense talked to you a lot about instabilities, and they showed you several pieces of evidence, so let's walk through these evidence. Let's walk through these pieces of evidence and show you how we proved our burden. The defense told you that Miss Testa ran all up and down the streets of the French Quarter Trailer Park. But she told you it was because Peter Seeger was following her with a hammer in his hand. She told you that if she had stopped at any of these homes, he would have caught up with her and he would have hit her again. This is not an inconsistency. The defense showed you this CT scan, and they tried to bring Dr. Shepard's conclusion into doubt that Miss Testa was suffering from 2 skull fractures. Well, this CT scan was done by Stephen Miller. Who's Stephen Miller? We don't know. We don't know his credentials. We don't know his qualifications. We don't know anything about him. But Dr. Shepard, the only one who saw Miss Testa's head wounds, told you that she was suffering from 2 skull fractures. So ask yourself, whose testimony is more reliable? This is not an inconsistency. The defense showed you this painting and told you that it doesn't have any blood or any dents on it. Well, Miss Testa told you when she got up on the stand that she could barely even hang this painting. She was so small compared to this painting that when she dropped it, that's when the defendant snapped. So little Miss Testa could barely even lift this huge painting off the floor. If you can see, it's bigger than this entire fireplace. So what do you expect? I mean, it didn't even fall that far. She could barely even hold it. This only goes to the credibility of her witness and her testimony today, and shows you that her story is right. This is not an inconsistency. And lastly, the defense showed you this hammer. But Dr. Shepard got up on the stand today and he explained to you what a simple depressed skull fracture means. A simple depressed skull fracture is a fracture in which the bone is broken but the skin is not. There wouldn't be any bleeding with a simple depressed skull fracture. Yes, there was blood on Miss Testa's knees and on her hands, but there's no blood on this hammer because she wasn't bleeding from the head. So this is not an inconsistency. The defense told you that today's case is about intoxication and instability, leading to inconsistent statements. Members of the jury, so what? Because Miss Testa had a drink last night, or that night, she can't be a victim? Because Miss Testa had a history of bulimia, cutting, and maybe bipolar, her words don't mean anything on the stand today? Her recount of the story doesn't mean anything today? Don't let them tell you that her words aren't good enough because she had a drink that night. Don't let them tell you she can't be a victim because she had a drink that night. Because she has everything to lose by getting on the stand today and nothing to gain. She can lose the father of her child by getting on that stand today, but she did it. Members of the jury, her cries were for help and our cries were for justice, and that is why we are asking you to do the only thing that the evidence allows. Find Peter Seeger guilty.